there's an umbilical cord, an invisible umbilical cord, a lifeline of support between Israel and the United States. Politicians in the Western government, or in the United States of America, and many other Western governments, they deem it to be in their own political career interests to support Israel. Public opinion is the strongest force amongst human societies. Public opinion determines whether women got the vote in this country, or it determines whether slavery was abolished. Einstein argued that Zionism is ridiculous because it asks that the minority of people in Palestine be given the land of Palestine. He said it should go to the majority. And then I asked the Zionist, is Einstein an anti-Semite? Israel doesn't want peace with people, it wants a piece of people's land. And that pretty much is it. I think they wanted me, they brought me on as the Muslim to bash, basically, but to make the platform look like it's balanced. We discuss the need to spread the message, but we equally, if not more so, need to discuss and teach the content of the message. You need to arm yourselves with intellectual weapons. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salam Nabi Kareem Muhammad wa alihi tayyibin wa sahbihi salihin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Barakallahu feekum for Taha Foundation for inviting me and for all of you attending. I have been in a few platforms you might have seen here and there. But I want to first talk to you about a different conflict, a different circumstance, which was similar to ours and that we can learn from. In 1976, South African black students rose in protest against the apartheid regime in Soweto. They were brutally suppressed, with 700 dead. This was reported in the media, the Soweto uprising and its brutal suppression, and it was the beginning of a serious turn in international opinion against the apartheid South African regime, which up until that point had been supported by the West and of which was deemed to be an outpost against communist takeover of Africa. By 1986, the Anti-Apartheid Act was passed in the United States of America by the American Senate, which led to substantial economic pressure against South Africa. This had a decisive effect on forcing the South African regime to end apartheid. Now, South Africa, like Israel, deems itself to be a Western outpost in an area of former colonial regimes, which are deemed to be anti-Western, even though most of those regimes are, in the Middle East, puppets of the West. But everyone's missing the main issue here. There's an umbilical cord, an invisible umbilical cord, a lifeline of support between Israel and the United States, predominantly. If that umbilical cord is cut, Israel is not a viable state. It only has its military and everything and its economic issues supported because America is willing to give it money for free, weapons for free, billions and billions of dollars worth, and replenish their stocks whenever they need it. This is only possible because politicians in the Western government, or in the United States of America and many other Western governments, they deem it to be in their own political career interests to support Israel. And that is only possible because of public opinion allows it. See, public opinion is the strongest force amongst human societies. Public opinion determines whether women got the vote in this country, or it determines whether slavery was abolished. All these things happened by public opinion, not from any lucky election, because these were actually cross-party issues. When public opinion changed, all the parties from all sides decided to support these things in the West. Therefore, public opinion is where the battle and, well, dare I say, the war lies. However, there are two obstacles to changing public opinion in the West: biased coverage of the events that happens in Gaza, in Lebanon, and of course now in Syria's buffer zone. And of course, the second one is the Zionist and pro-Israeli narrative that is being peddled without effective challenge throughout platforms and institutions of power. Part of the reason there hasn't been an effective challenge is because most people are not clued up on Palestinian history, the history of the Zionist movement, and the details of Israel's many military operations, as well as the legal issues which are being discussed, such as apartheid, genocide, the dispossession of land, discrimination against Palestinians both in the West Bank and even within Israel itself, as well as the plans for their gradual expulsion and their history of active expulsion. So the key issue here is narrative. You have to learn the true narrative. And if you don't know what that narrative is, if you don't know the details, then you'll be up against very slick, very glossy, groomed, and very sharp pro-Zionist advocates and supporters who will make the sky seem like the ground seem like the sky, 2 + 2 = 5, and white is black and black is white. That's what they do. To this end, in my own capacity, I've used platforms, lectures, and debates to educate people, to teach them about the true narrative behind what's going on, but not just the narrative, but also how to express it and how to refute the Zionist narrative. That's, you could say, my specialism I've put myself into. And I primarily use public debates for that, mainly because any platform that I will get invited onto is going to be a contested one. Any platform in the West that any Muslim or Palestinian advocate will be invited to will most likely be a contested platform, and at best a contested platform, at worst a very biased and slanted platform. Now, I've often said that anyone can sound convincing if they're the only person on stage and no one's challenging them. So I like to show the truth by means of using an opponent. My opponent in a debate, I view them as my teaching assistant. They're going to help me teach you how to refute their ideology, their interest, and their movement when it is for injustice. And to wit, I have attended many such platforms. One of them you might know is by Piers Morgan and his so-called uncensored platform. Although if he doesn't like you, he censors you from even attending. Apparently, Mohammed Hijab is no longer welcome. What happened to free speech and uncensorship? Huh? No censorship. So what I've tried to do in this platforms is to really just show the audience, my target audience is the audience, how hypocritical is the narrative peddled by either the person who's the host or one of their guests. And I show you by engaging them and show you how to engage. And that's basically what I've been trying to do, is basically an educational drive in that sense. Rather than just simply printing out leaflets, or that's old school now, or just putting out marketing campaigns for the Palestinian narrative. We have that, but guess what? Algorithms limit the reach of those things. So the issue is, you need to target the Western intelligentsia, intellectuals, professionals, decision makers, and they need a very sophisticated narrative that shows the details, that shows the actual what's going on, things that can't be denied, things that the Zionist advocates can't deny. So on the Piers Morgan program, what he wanted to do when I attended was, he mostly wanted to malign a person that is known in the Muslim community, a Muslim doctor whose years of service has been unimpeachable in terms of his profession, but because he was with a political group, he was been slated to be attacked. And so obviously I discussed with Piers Morgan on that. But also he wanted to do his standard thing, which was to asymmetrically evaluate and invite comment on the Gaza situation by saying, are Hamas terrorists? Was October the 7th a terrorist operation? But not discuss whether Israel is a terrorist state and whether it's committing terrorism that defined by the deliberate targeting of civilians to achieve political goals. That's the universal definition of it. And I came in with a strategy, which was, I call it the agree definitions and then agree universal application approach. We agree a definition and then we apply it universally. Simple as that. So I asked him to define terrorism. I actually was planning to expose his hypocrisy. I wasn't expecting that I'd be exposing his ignorance too, as he went in a kind of circular argument, because he didn't actually know how to define it, or he was worried that if he defined it too well, it would then apply to Israel, of course. And then when he actually did argue that targeting civilians is not necessarily terrorism, because I asked him about, what about the Allies in World War II targeting German civilians? Was that terrorism? Was Winston Churchill a terrorist? He didn't want to do that. I knew that that's one of his red lines. And then he argued, oh, but that was okay because of who we were fighting, the danger they represented. And then at the very end of that, I said, Well, then can that not be argued by the Palestinians then? That who they are fighting, the danger they represent to their existence, wiping them out? Then, and of course, he didn't want to be consistent on his own logic. And that's all I've been arguing is consistency, because consistency breaks falsehood and it exposes hypocrisy. So that was on the Piers Morgan program, and he was unable to apply a set of standards consistently to the state of Israel. Then I also did a debate in both Durham University and in Manchester. In Manchester, I was invited by a Zionist to do a debate on, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? And he said he was going to get a venue, a local venue in Manchester, so I agreed to it. Okay, that's fine. I didn't know he'd actually get the University of Manchester to host it. And not just like the student club or society that usually hosts events and so on. No. The actual administration of the university hosted it. That's leverage, huh? How did he pull that one off? Anyway, now the only reason I agreed to that debate was because many Palestinian pro-Palestinian rights encampments at universities have been dealt with in America violently in many cases. In England, the students have been threatened by the university administration, have been viewed as being racists and anti-Semites. And that was used as a pretext to shut down these encampments. So it was purely to stand up for the rights of these students to protest something that is an issue of moral conscience without being called racists falsely as a deflection tactic, that I agreed to such a debate. And I did the debate to show that being anti-Zionist is not being anti-Semitic. In fact, it is the Zionists who are actually anti-Semitic in many of their own arguments, because they're actually arguing that if you are for justice, that's anti-Jewish. So that means then that Jewishness is anti-justice. And isn't that not anti-Semitic? So I called him up on this. I called him up on quotes that most people haven't really used, like Einstein argued that Zionism is ridiculous because it asks that the minority of people in Palestine be given the land of Palestine. He said it should go to the majority. And then I asked the Zionist, is Einstein an anti-Semite? And he refused to comment on that. But also, interestingly, I also
he said it's relative.
Sorry?
He said it's relative.
No, he didn't say. He didn't say it at all. Wouldn't comment on Einstein, so we could then argue that, well, we're not being anti-Semitic. We're just merely parroting what Einstein says. Yeah. So is Einstein? I even made a joke. Does E equals anti-Semitism squared? So. And I also said about I used the opportunity. I said that I used him. Right? He was wanting to use me, but I came in to use him. And I asked him, I said, is Free Palestine, saying Free Palestine, anti-Semitic? Okay, so he did say, well, he's wary where I was going to go to this. Okay, well, it depends on how it's used. I said, okay, but there's a group in America called, it's a Jewish group, I said, called the American League for a Free Palestine. Are they anti-Semitic? So he was thinking that my strategy was, I'm going to get him, like, would he dare condemn fellow Jews as being anti-Semitic? And he thought, of course he would. So he said, yes, they are anti-Semites. And he didn't realize that, I said, well, that group actually it's in 1947. And they were supporting the Zionist Irgun. They were Zionists. And they wanted to kick out the British occupation of Palestine. So he just condemned his own people. And everyone in the audience laughed. Even some Zionists laughed at him, actually. Right? And that kind of showed that just simply because they said Free Palestine. And I said, how comes if you say Free Palestine, it's okay if you're Zionist in the context of removing the British occupation, or Free South Africa, it's okay because everyone knows that doesn't mean a white genocide, right? But if you say the exact same phrase for Palestine today, it's somehow racist, supporting genocide, anti-Semitic. So that quite embarrassed him a lot, and he still keeps tweeting at me right now. I live rent-free in his head. Ironically, there's an occupation of me in his head. I then did a debate at the University of Durham. I was later to discover that was an unfair debate because they got a bunch of first-year students to represent the Palestinian side, and I was the only one on my side that actually had, you could say, done a bit more than a cursory study of the issue of Palestine and history in the Zionist movement. And on the other side, they had all these graduates and activists, long-term activists for Zionism. And the titled the debate is that this House believes the Palestinian leadership is the biggest obstacle to peace, which was a ridiculous title. And all the Zionists were praising this free speech. This is free speech. And of course, the Oxford Union, a month or so later, would have a title for their debate. This House believes that Israel is a apartheid committing genocide. And then it's, oh, this is anti-Semitic. How dare you have such a debate title? So that kind of showed the double standards of Zionists. But I went in that debate and I said, could we argue that the biggest obstacle to the peace in Ukraine is the Ukrainian government? The Russians have given them so many peace deals and they've always refused. So, maybe it's the Ukrainians' problem. And we say that's ridiculous because the peace deals are, we keep your land and we have peace. We've stolen it and now let's help us get away with it. No one would say, I also said that the biggest obstacle, it's like saying the biggest obstacle also to the abolition of slavery are the black slaves. Or the biggest obstacle to the end of apartheid is the black South Africans. That's how ridiculous the motion was. Zionists in the audience started to get really angry and quite, were jeering and so on and so forth. But I came on and I just made a simple point, which is, who's really for peace? Okay, the Palestinians, the PLO has, in 1993, eschewed violence, became the Palestinian Authority. They recognized the State of Israel's right to exist, quote unquote, whatever that means. And yet, look what's happening in the West Bank. They're still being settled, dispossessed, persecuted, harassed, and so on. Peace didn't seem to work out for the Palestinians when they tried it. I also pointed out that in 2002, although technically also in 1987, all the Arab states got together and said, let's normalize with Israel. All you have to do, Israel, is recognize international boundaries, the 1967 boundaries, give back the West Bank, Golan, and Gaza, and we will not only all have peace with you, but we will also all normalize. Even Iran was on board with that. There were Hamas representatives that said they were not going to contest that offer. And of course, the PLO, or the Palestinian Authority was part of endorsing that. See, the Middle East peace would have come overnight with a very simple offer. Just agree to the international boundaries that everyone else recognizes. Israel said no. Everyone in the audience was surprised to hear this. Maybe you're surprised to hear this. Not saying that I support giving away land and so on, but I'm simply I simply make these points simply to show that the narrative that Israel's all about, it just wants peace and will do whatever it wants for peace, but everyone just hates it just because they hate Jews, is a ridiculous and patently false narrative. And hence I said, and I said it to a colleague of mine before he went on to do a debate and he used it, but I've kind of had this phrase, Israel doesn't want peace with people, it wants a piece of people's land. And that pretty much is it. So these are kind of mantras, you could say, I've been trying to repeat, trying to popularize. Because have you ever noticed that Zionists, every Zionist you hear on TV or on any kind of the platform, they all say the exact same things. It could have been a Singapore of the Mediterranean. They say that exact same phrase. Gaza could have been like a Singapore if it wasn't for Hamas and their pesky tunnels and what have you. Say, well, wait a second. Tunnels or no tunnels, who controls the fishing of the extent that you can fish out into Mediterranean? Who controls the boundaries? Egypt is bound by treaty with Israel to control the Rafah border crossing, and it can't let in goods there. Goods have to go via the Israeli crossing. All right? So Israel and Egypt have an agreement that Egypt has to let Israel control what goes in, the goods that go into Gaza. Does Singapore have these restrictions and limitations? Nope. So, does Singapore have to put up with people bombing its power plants and its water treatment plants? Nope. So that's a false narrative. But have you seen how all the Zionists say this? Because, and there was a great documentary that came out called Israelism, I believe. It showed that they're all given these talking points, almost like books to read, study. They all say these things in a very formulaic way. And they all march out and say the exact same things everywhere they go. We need that same approach. but not formulas, but knowledge. I don't want people to recite phrases or mantras. I want them to actually know about this so they can argue effectively to people who can have a change or impact on the ground. I was also invited onto that bastion of tolerance, respect, and understanding, GB News. I think they wanted me, they brought me on as the Muslim to bash, basically, but to make the platform look like it's balanced, right? They brought me on. They're probably a stickler for punishment, because every time I've come onto that platform, I basically just subvert it and change it to my own tune. But the topics are ridiculous. So I think they only kind of resort to me as a last resort, right, just to get someone on. So they had a discussion on, is it fair that Israel's banned from sports, right, because of what's happening politically? And I say, well, you guys were saying that Russia should be banned from sports, or the Eurovision. Actually, what's Israel doing in the Eurovision? It's not in Europe. It doesn't belong in Europe. Actually, no. Israel exactly belongs in Europe. Yes, I changed that, yeah. So I've argued this. I said that apartheid South Africa was banned from sports. So we're just not being consistent. They had issues with displaying the Palestinian flag. I say, well, in England, we display the Ukrainian flag as solidarity. They had issues with, I debated with Nigel Farage on, does Israel have a right to exist? And I argued that no state has a right to exist. People have a right to exist. That's the case. States are fictions, right? And I said that before the UN reporter. Someone said, you nicked it off. No, if you look chronologically, I said it first, right? So, and of course, he had no response to that, because he thought I would have to say yes or no to that question. But if I say no states have a right to exist, then that kind of disarms him. And of course, he argued that Free Palestine is anti-Semitic or a call to genocide. And again, that's ridiculous. It's like me saying that Black Lives Matter means that strategy a lot when discussing on Palestine. We discuss the need to spread the message, but we equally, if not more so, need to discuss and teach the content of the message. You need to arm yourselves with intellectual weapons. I often say that, in essence, what I am is an intellectual arms manufacturer. I basically do the research, and many people are far more qualified than me, who've devoted their whole lives to this, like Norman Finkelstein and so on and so forth, devoted 50 years of his life to doing the research to arm the movement for rights, for human dignity for the Palestinians, to equip them with knowledge. So equip yourself, arm yourself with knowledge, and then spread it. Don't just talk about strategy all the time. And as I said, one of the fascinating things we should actually learn something from Zionists in the West. See, Zionists don't have the numbers. Although in America you have obviously evangelical Christians, which are in the millions. Technically speaking, the majority of Zionists are evangelical Christians in America by numbers. But they don't have the numbers. So we've confused numbers with power. It's not always the case. For Zionists, it's targeted. They go to politicians. They go to university administrations and organize debates, right? They go to influentials, thought leaders, intellectuals. It's time we ourselves adopt not just the quantity strategy, but also the quality strategy too. Barakallahu feek.